Shortly after our return to St. Cloud, the first consul, being out in a carriage with his wife and Monsieur Cambaceres, took the notion to drive, for in hand the horses attached to it, which were those that had been given to him by the inhabitants of Antwerp. He mounted on the box, therefore, and took the reins from the hands of Cesar, his coachman, who got up behind. They were just then in the Horseshoe Valley, which goes by way of the Breteuil Pavilion and Ville-d'Avray. It says in the Memorial de St. Helena that the aides-de-camp, having awkwardly crossed the horses, made them run away. Cesar, who gave me all the details of this lamentable adventure, did not say a word about the aide-de-camp. And in all conscience, no other awkwardness was required to upset the carriage than that of a coachman as inexperienced as the first consul. Besides, the horses were young and spirited, and Cesar himself needed all his skill to drive them. Not feeling his hand any longer, they started off at a gallop, and Cesar, seeing the new direction they were taking towards the right, began to shout, "To the left!" with the voice of a stentor. Consul Cambaceres, paler than ever, took very little pains to reassure the frightened Madame Bonaparte, but cried with all his might, "Stop, stop, you're going to smash us!" That might easily have happened, but the first consul heard nothing, and moreover, he was no longer master of his horses. On arriving, or rather being dragged to the gate, he could not take the middle of the road, but ran against a post and fell out heavily. Fortunately, the horses stopped. The first consul, thrown 10 feet and striking on his stomach, fainted and did not come to himself until someone touched him to pick him up. Madame Bonaparte and the second consul received only slight contusions, but the good Josephine had suffered horribly from anxiety about her husband. However, though he had been really shaken up, he would not be bled, and contented himself with being rubbed with cologne water, his favorite remedy. That night, on going to bed, he talked gaily about his mishap and the extreme fright which his colleague had displayed, and ended by saying, "We must render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Let him keep his whip, and everyone stick to his trade." He admitted, however, in spite of his pleasantries, that he had never thought himself so near death, and even that he deemed himself dead for some seconds. I do not remember whether it was on this occasion or on some other that I heard the emperor say that death was nothing but a sleep without dreams. In October of this year, the first consul received in public audience Haile Effendi, ambassador of the Ottoman Porte. The arrival of the Turkish ambassador made a sensation at the Tuileries because he brought a great quantity of cashmere shawls to the first consul. People were sure they would be distributed, and each woman flattered herself on being favorably treated. I think that without his strange costume, and especially without his cashmeres, he would have produced very little effect on persons accustomed to see sovereign princes pay their court to the head of the government, both at home and abroad. Even his costume was not more remarkable than that of Rustam, to which we were accustomed, and as to his obeisances, they were hardly more profound than those of ordinary courtiers of the first consul at Paris. They say that the enthusiasm lasted longer. 'Tis so droll to be a Turk. Some ladies had the honor to see the bearded ambassador eat. He was polite and even gallant with them, and gave them several presents which were most boasted of. His manners were not too Mussulman-like, and he was not afraid to see our pretty Parisians without a veil on their faces. One day, which he spent almost entirely at St. Cloud, I saw him making his prayer. It was in the court of honor on a large parapet bordered by a stone balustrade. The ambassador had carpets stretched alongside the apartments, which were afterwards those of the King of Rome, and there he made his genuflections in sight of several members of the household, who, out of discretion, kept themselves behind the shutters. In the evening, he was present at the theater. I think they played Zer or Mahomet. He didn't understand a word. Chapter 12. In November of this year, the first consul returned to Bologna to visit the flotilla and review some troops which were already assembled there in the camps destined for the army with which he proposed to descend upon England. I have preserved some notes and still more souvenirs of my different sojourns to Bologna. Never did the emperor display elsewhere a greater military power. Never did anyone see assembled on one spot troops that were finer or readier to march at the slightest sign from their chief. It is not surprising, then, that I have found in my memory of this epic details, which no one, I think, has yet thought of publishing, nor has any person, if I do not deceive myself, been in a better position to know them than I. As to that, the reader will soon be able to judge for himself. In the different reviews held by the first consul, he seemed to wish to excite the enthusiasm of the soldiers and their attachment to his person, by the care with which he seized every occasion to flatter their self-love. One day, having particularly remarked the excellent appearance of the 36th and 57th regiments of the line and of the 10th Light Infantry, he made all the chiefs come out of their ranks, from the corporals to the colonels, and going amongst them, he showed his satisfaction by reminding them of the occasions when, under the fire of cannon, he had also made complimentary remarks on these three brave regiments. He complimented the non-commissioned officers on the good training of the soldiers and the captains and chiefs of battalion on the ensemble and precision of his maneuvers. In a word, each had his share of praise. This flattering distinction did not excite the jealousy of the other army corps. Each regiment had received that day its greater or lesser portion of compliments, and when the review ended, they returned peaceably to their cantonments. But the soldiers of the 36th, 57th, and 10th, very proud of having been favored so signally, went in the afternoon to display their triumph in an out-of-town cafe frequented by the mounted grenadiers of the guard. They began by quiet drinking, talking about campaigns, cities that had been taken, the first consul, and finally the morning's review. Then some young men of Bologna who had mingled with the drinkers took the notion of singing some very recently composed couplets in which the bravery and the exploits of the three regiments were lauded to the skies without a word being said of the rest of the army. Not even the guard, and it was the favorite cafe of the guard that these couplets were sung. The latter at first maintained a gloomy silence, but presently pushed too far. They loudly protested against these verses, which they declared detestable. The quarrel began in a very lively fashion. There was a good deal of shouting. They insulted each other and separated, but without too much noise, giving a rendezvous for the next morning at 4 o'clock in the environs of Marchesa, a little village 2 leagues from Bologna. It was very late in the evening when the soldiers left the cafe. More than 200 grenadiers of the guard repaired separately to the place of the rendezvous and found the ground occupied by nearly equal number of adversaries of the 36th, 57th, and the 10th. Without explanations, without uproar, each took his saber in his hand and fought during more than an hour with appalling coolness. One Martin, a grenadier of the guard, a man of gigantic stature, killed with his own hand 7 or 8 soldiers of the 10th. They would probably all have been massacred if General St. Hilaire apprised too late of the sanguinary quarrel and not at once sent out a regiment of cavalry, which put a stop to the fighting. The grenadiers had lost 10 men, and the soldiers of the line 13. The wounded on both sides were very many. The first consul went to the camp the next morning, had the provocators of this terrible scene brought before him, and said to them in a severe tone, "I know why you fought. Several brave men have succumbed in a struggle unworthy of them and of you. You shall be punished. I have ordered that the verses which were the cause of so many misfortunes shall be printed. I intend that in learning your punishment, the Bolognese shall know that you have forfeited the esteem of your brothers in arms." Meanwhile, the troops, and especially the officers, began to be tired of their stay in Bologna, a city less adapted, perhaps than any other, to render an inactive existence supportable. Nevertheless, they did not murmur, for there had never been found room for murmurs where the first consul was, but they stormed with bated breath at being kept in camp or in the harbor with England before them and only 9 or 10 leagues off. Pleasures were rare in Bologna. The Bolognese women, charming persons in general, dared not give parties in their own houses, lest they should displease their husbands, very jealous men, like all Picards, and yet there was a fine hall in which balls and soirees might easily have been given, but although they may have wished to, these ladies dared not make use of it. It was necessary that a certain number of fair Parisians, moved by the sad fate of so many brave and handsome officers, should come to Bologna to beguile the weariness of so long a repose. The example of the Parisians piqued the women of Abbeville, Dunkirk, and Amiens, and Bologna was presently replenished with male and female strangers who came to do the honors of the city. Among all these ladies, she who attracted the most attention by an excellent tone and plenty of wit and beauty was one Madame F. of Dunkirk, an excellent musician full of gaiety, graces, and youth. It was impossible that Madame F. should not turn many heads. Colonel Joseph, brother of the first consul, General Soult, who was afterwards Marshal, General Saint-Hilaire, and Andrassy, and several other great personages were at her feet. Only two succeeded in making themselves acceptable, and of these, one was Colonel Joseph, who soon passed in the town for the favorite lover of Madame F. The fair Dunkirker often gave soirees at which Colonel Joseph never failed to be present among all his rivals, and he certainly had a good many. One alone took umbrage at him. This was Soult, the general-in-chief. This rivalry was not at all prejudicial to the interests of Madame F. Like a skillful tactician, she adroitly provoked the jealousy of her two aspirants by accepting in turn from each of them compliments, bouquets of roses, and better than that occasionally. The first consul, informed of his brother's amours, took the whim one evening of going to amuse himself at the little salon of Madame F., which was merely a room on the first story of a joiner's house in the Rue de Mimine. So as not to be recognized, he put on citizen's dress and wore a wig and spectacles. He took General Bertrand into his confidence, who was already in great favor with him and who was careful to do all in his power to make himself unrecognizable. Thus disguised, the first consul and his companion presented themselves at Madame F's and asked for the major domo, Arcambal. The strictest incognito was recommended to Monsieur Arcambal by the first consul, who would not have been recognized for all the world. Monsieur Arcambal promised secrecy. The two visitors were announced as civil commissioners at the army. They were playing bouillotte. The tables were covered with gold, and the game and the punch absorbed the attention of the joyous habitués to such a point that none of them took any heed of the two personages who had just entered. As to the mistress of the house, she had never seen close by either the first consul or General Bertrand. Consequently, there was nothing to fear from her. I can well believe that Colonel Joseph recognized his brother, but he gave no sign of it. The first consul, avoiding observation as much as possible, watched the looks interchanged between his brother and Madame F., convinced of their mutual understanding. He was about to quit the salon of the pretty Dunkirker when she, who did not fancy seeing the number of her guests diminishing as yet, ran to the pretended commissioners and graciously detained them, saying that they were going to play little games and that they must not go without having given forfeits. The first consul, having consulted General Bertrand by a glance, found it amusing to remain and play at innocent games. In fact, at the end of several minutes, on the request of Madame F., the players deserted bouillotte and ranged themselves in a circle around her. They began by dancing the boulangère, then followed the innocent games. It came the first consul's turn to give a forfeit. He was at first much embarrassed, having nothing about him but a scrap of paper in which he had written the names of certain colonels in lead pencil. However, he confided this paper to Madame F., begging her not to open it. The wish of the first consul was respected, and the paper remained closed on the knees of the fair lady until the forfeit should be redeemed. This moment arrived, and someone imposed on the great captain the singular penance of playing the porter, while Madame F., with Colonel Joseph, should make the voyage to Cythera in the next room. The first consul acquitted himself with a good grace of the part he had to play. Then, after the forfeits had been returned, he signed to General Bertrand to follow him. They went out, and presently the joiner, who lived on the ground floor, came up to deliver a little note to Madame F. It contained these words: I thank you, Madame, for the amiable welcome you have given me. If you come some day to my barack, I will again play the porter if you like, but this game I will not leave to others the care of accompanying you in the voyage to Cythera. Signed, Bonaparte. The charming Dunkirker read the note to herself, but she did not allow the givers of forfeits to remain ignorant that they had received a visit of the first consul. At the end of an hour, they separated, leaving Madame F. alone to reflect on the visit and the note of the great man. It was during this same sojourn that there was a terrible combat. in the roadstead of Bologna to protect the entry into the port of a flotilla composed of 20 or 30 vessels coming from Ostend, Dunkirk, and Newport, loaded with munitions for the National Fleet, a magnificent frigate carrying 36 cannon, a cutter, and a brig of the first rank were detached from the English fleet in order to intercept the Batavian flotilla, but they were received in a manner that deprived them of all wish to return there. The port of Bologna was defended by 5 forts: the Fort de la Crèche, the Fort en Bois, the Fort Moussoir, and the Ordnance Tower, all provided with an extraordinary abundance of cannon and mortars. The line of broadside, which barred the entry, was composed of 250 gunboats and other vessels. The division of Imperial gunboats formed part of them. Each gunboat carried 3 24-pound cannons, 2 bow chasers, and 1 stern chaser, 500 pieces of ordnance. Then were playing on the enemy independently of all the batteries of the forts. Each piece fired more than 3 times a minute. The fight began at 1 in the afternoon. The weather was superb. At the first discharge of cannon, the first consul left the headquarters at the Pont de Brick and went off at a gallop, followed by a staff, to give his orders to Admiral Bouy. Presently, wishing to observe for himself the movements of the defense and aid in directing them, he jumped into a boat rowed by the Marines of the Guard and was followed by the Admiral and several officers. Thus it was that the first consul went into the midst of the vessels which formed the line of broadside, through 1,000 dangers and a rain of shells, bombs, and bullets, intending to land at Vimereux. After having gone through the line, he turned towards the Croix Tower, saying that he must double it. Admiral Bouy, alarmed at the thought of the useless danger they were going to incur, represented the imprudence of this maneuver to the first consul. What shall we gain by doubling this fort? Nothing but bullets. General, by turning it, we should arrive just as quickly. The first consul was not of the admiral's opinion. He persisted in wishing to double the tower. The admiral, at the risk of being cashiered, gave contrary orders to the sailors, and the first consul saw himself obliged to pass behind the fort, very much irritated and addressing reproaches to the admiral, which very soon ceased, for the yawl had hardly passed when a transport boat, which had doubled the Croix Tower, was crushed and sunk by 3 or 4 shells. The first consul held his peace on seeing how right the admiral had been, and the rest of the way was accomplished without hindrance as far as the little port of Vimereux. On arriving there, he went up the cliff to encourage the cannoneers. He spoke to every one of them, slapped them on the shoulder, and incited them to take good aim. "Courage, my friends," he said to them. "Think that you are fighting fellows who will hold out a long time. Send them off with the honors of war, while looking at the fine resistance and the majestic maneuvers of the frigate." He asked, "Do you think the captain can be English, my lads? I don't believe it." The gunners, inflamed by the words of the first consul, redoubled their ardor and speed. "Keep looking at the frigate, General," cried one of them. "The bowsprit is going to come down." He had spoken truly. The mast of the bowsprit was cut in 2 by the ball. "Give this fellow 20 francs," said the first consul, addressing the officers who followed him. Besides the batteries of Vimereux was a forge to heat the bullets. The first consul watched the smiths at work and gave them his advice. "That is not red enough, my lads. We must send them redder than that. Come, come." One of the men had known him as the lieutenant of artillery and said to his comrades, "He understands these little things finely, just as he does big ones." That day, 2 soldiers without arms, who stationed on the cliff were looking at the maneuvers, began to quarrel with each other in a very comical manner. "Look," said one, "do you see the little corporal down there?" "No, I don't see him." "What? Don't you see him in his yawl?" "Ah, yes, but he can't be thinking what he is about, that's sure. If he should get a rap now, he would set the whole army crying. Why does he expose himself like that?" "Heavens, that's his place." "Not at all." "I say it is." "No, I say." "Look here, what would you do tomorrow if the little corporal killed? But I tell you that's his place, etc. And not having, as it appears, strong enough arguments on either side, they came to fisticuffs. It took a good deal of trouble to separate them. The combat had begun at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and about 10 in the evening the Batavian flotilla entered the port amidst the most horrible firing I ever saw. In this obscurity, the bombs, which crossed each other in every direction, formed an arch of fire above the harbor and the city. The continual explosion of all this artillery was repeated by the echoes from the cliffs with a frightful noise, and singularly enough, not a person in the city was afraid. The Bolognese had become accustomed to danger. They were expecting something terrible every day. They had their preparations for attack or defense under their eyes all the time. They had become soldiers by dint of seeing them. On that day, they dined to the roar of cannon, but everybody dined. The dinner hour was neither advanced nor retarded. Men went to their business. Women occupied themselves with their housekeeping. Young girls practiced the piano. All beheld with indifference the cannonballs passing over their heads, and the curious whom a desire to see the combat had attracted to the cliff seemed scarcely more effective than people usually are on seeing a military piece played at Franconi's. I still wonder how these three vessels could have endured for more than 9 hours such a violent shock. At the moment when the flotilla entered the port, the English cutter had sunk. The brig had been burned by the red-hot balls. Nothing remained but the frigate with its masts shattered, its sails torn, and yet standing as immovable as a rock. It was so close to the line of broadside that the sailors on either side could recognize and count each other. Behind her, at a reasonable distance, were more than 100 English sail. At last, after 10 o'clock, a signal from the English admiral made the frigate put about, and the firing ceased. The line of broadside was not greatly damaged in this long and terrible fight, because the guns of the frigate carried nearly always into the rigging and never into the body of the boats. The brig and the cutter did the most harm. Chapter 13. The first consul quitted Bologna to return to Paris, where he wished to be present at the marriage of one of his sisters. Prince Camillo Borghese, a descendant of one of the most noble families of Rome, had arrived there to marry Madame Pauline Bonaparte, widow of General Leclerc, who died of yellow fever at Santo Domingo. I remember having seen this unhappy general at the house of the first consul some time before his departure for the fatal expedition which cost him his life, and France the loss of so many brave soldiers and of enormous sums of money. General Leclerc, whose name is now almost forgotten, or even in some sort abandoned to contempt, was a kind and benevolent man. He was passionately enamored of his wife, whose levity, to say nothing worse, afflicted and plunged him into a profound and habitual melancholy which it was painful to behold. The Princess Pauline, who was far enough from being a princess then, had nevertheless married him freely and from choice, which did not prevent her from tormenting her husband by caprices without end, and telling him 100 times a day that he was very fortunate in having a sister of the first consul for his wife. I am convinced that, with his simple tastes and pacific temper, General Leclerc would have liked less brilliancy and more repose with respect better. The first consul had required his sister to accompany the general to Santo Domingo. She was obliged to obey and to quit Paris, where she wielded the scepter of fashion and eclipsed all other women by her elegance and her coquetry as much as by her incomparable beauty, in order to go and brave a dangerous climate and the ferocious companions of Christophe and Dessalines. At the close of the year 1801, the flagship Océan had sailed for the Cape with General Leclerc, his wife, and their son on board. On arriving at the Cape, the conduct of Madame Leclerc was above all praise. On more than one occasion, but particularly on that which I am going to try to recall, she displayed a courage worthy of her name and the position of her husband. I have these details from an eyewitness whom I knew in Paris in the service of Pauline. The day of the great insurrection of the Blacks in September 1802, the bands of Christophe and Dessalines composed of more than 12,000 Negroes exasperated by their hatred against the whites and their certainty that if they failed, no quarter would be given them, came to assault the Cape Town, which was defended by only 1,000 soldiers. These were the only remnants of that numerous army which had gone out of Brest a year earlier, so brilliant and so full of hope. This handful of heroes, the majority of them weak from fever, commanded by the general-in-chief of the expedition, who was likewise suffering from a malady of which he died, repulsed the repeated attacks of the Negroes with unheard of efforts and heroic valor. During the combat, in which the fury, if not the numbers and force, were equal on both sides, Madame Leclerc was with her son and under the guard of a devoted friend who had only a weak artillery company at his orders in the house where her husband had established his residence, at the foot of the rocks bordering the coast. The general-in-chief, fearing lest this residence might be surprised by a part of the enemy, and unable to foresee the result of the struggle he was maintaining at the upper end of the Cape, where the blacks were making their most furious assaults, sent orders to have his wife and son taken on board the French fleet. Pauline would not consent to it. Always true to the pride inspired in her by her name, though there was this time both grandeur and nobility in her pride, she said to the ladies of the city, who had taken shelter with her and who were entreating her to depart and telling her horrible things about the treatment to which women were exposed by the Negroes, "The rest of you can go. You are not Bonaparte's sisters."